Hello and welcome back to Tinker Talks Guns. Today we're going to talk about revolvers. Why? That's one of the things we're going to cover. Why revolvers? So, before we get to that, I'd like to thank my Patreons for their support. The guns, ammo, everything costs money, and these videos cost money to make. And people have been very generous with their donations, and I very much appreciate it. And not just cash donations through Patreon. People have loaned me guns so I could examine, fire, and review them, check out modifications to guns, all sorts of different things. And it's all very, very much appreciated. Now, if you'd like to do this the easy way and just kick a buck or two a month my way via Patreon, there's a link in the description below. It's 2023, and revolvers are still around. So why would anyone be interested in a revolver? Because we've made very, very good semi-automatic pistols for some time, and they fill a great many niches, particularly when it comes to self-defense, personal protection, home defense. Why revolvers? Well, the most obvious case is as a hunting weapon, because revolvers are, generally speaking, available in more potent calibers than semi-autos. There are a couple exceptions, like the Kunin and the Desert Eagle. But for the most part, if you want a very powerful repeating handgun, you're really going to be looking at a revolver. And revolvers are very reliable in the field. This U.S. Arms Abilene 44 Magnum has taken deer and other game animals. And it's really well suited to hunting in relatively close quarters, which is most of where I hunt for large game. But people do still use them for home defense and self-defense. And why that is a highly individual thing. Some people are like me, they're old. Revolvers were the main handgun. Yes, there were lots of semi-autos, but for the most part, older police officers, sometimes old soldiers, or just older people, revolvers were the default handgun for long after semi-automatic pistols were invented. And so revolvers like the Smith & Wesson M&P are very, very common. And some older folks are just more comfortable with what they've always known. You have to understand that not everybody who wants a handgun for self-defense is a dedicated pistolero or lifestyle shooter. Some people just want something around that they're confident in and know how to use that will just do the job. And that's it. And for those people, a revolver suits them very well. I do know younger people who carry revolvers, people in their 20s and 30s, because they just find it suits them. And if you're going to have a gun for self-defense, it should be one that suits you. And this is sort of an ineffable, hard to quantify thing. Why one gun suits one person, another gun suits another person. I have this with Glocks. I mean, my first Glock I got in 1985. And it's a great gun. Glocks, by and large, are fantastic guns, but they just don't suit me. So, I have consistently carried other guns. Pretty often, I carried a revolver. Sometimes, once in a while, I still drop the trusty Airweight J-frame in my pocket for a quick trip to a convenience store or to put gas in the car. And they're suited to task. Now, few in this day and age would argue that revolvers are really the best choice for a service pistol for police or military personnel, because they have very different circumstances than civilians. First of all, they encounter people who may not run away when you shoot at them much, much, much more often than civilians do. This doesn't mean that revolvers are less capable. Yes, they're obsolete as a service pistol. And as I've said before, I do still know cops who carry them, but these are unusual individuals, and I certainly would not consider them poorly armed with their revolvers. Generally speaking, they're very, very good with them. But on the whole, as an average sort of gun, the day of the revolver being the standard issue police pistol are long past. As they should be. Technology moves on, circumstances change, and if I were going to, by some catastrophic failure of judgment, go back on the street on duty, I would definitely carry a modern high-capacity 9mm because it's a better tool for the job. But for civilian self-defense or home defense, a revolver is still going to do the job perfectly well. Now, yes, they're lower capacity. Typically, they hold 5 to 8 shots. Most of them 6 to 7. But, you know, there are outliers. They come in calibers from .22 long rifle to 500 Smith & Wesson Magnum, which is approximately as powerful as a 12-gauge shotgun slug. I didn't believe it either, but check the numbers. And, you know, is actually more powerful than any handgun really needs to be. But that's a whole nother discussion, possibly argument. Mostly for self-defense or home defense, people are going to go with a revolver of moderate size, mostly 2 to 4 inches of barrel. Some people might prefer a 6-inch or whatever, but if you're going to cross over into concealed carry, typically something with a 3-inch barrel or shorter, or 4, people vary, is going to be your weapon of choice. Now, broadly speaking, there are two types of revolvers. Single action revolvers, where you must cock the hammer in order to fire the weapon. Typically, such pistols are relegated either to cowboy action shooting matches or hunting. The other type, of course, is the double action revolver, which in practice typically means it is both double and single action. In other words, a trigger pull will cock the hammer and fire the gun, or it can be thumb cocked to give you a short, light, more precise trigger pull. And typically when we talk about a defensive revolver, you can pretty much treat it as being strictly double action. And an awful lot of them are double action only. The extremely popular Smith & Wesson 442, or their, Centennial hammerless series, are an exemplar of the type. They're also made by a variety of other manufacturers, including Kimber and others. And I am of the opinion, I have a lot of opinions, I am of the opinion that anyone who's into guns should probably have a revolver or two around, just for broadening their knowledge base, sense of history, or whatever. And if somebody wants to carry a revolver as their primary self-defense weapon, they're going to get no argument from me. The thing is about a double-action revolver is that trigger pull is heavier than people are used to in this day and age. I got to lean way back. It's longer, it's heavier. On a good revolver, it's commendably smooth. And you can get snap caps and dry fire practice, where you practice keeping the sights aligned exactly where you want them while you pull the trigger, and eventually you get to where you can pull the trigger quite quickly. Now, are there advantages to revolvers? Yes. The primary advantage is that they are extremely reliable. They're not perfect. These are still machines. Things still go wrong. But on the whole, they are much, much less likely to malfunction than a semi-automatic. And that's going some because a lot of semi-automatics just don't much malfunction. This is a very cheap modern semi-automatic. I paid $200 retail for it, this year, and it's brand new, and it's just crossed the 1,000 round mark with no malfunctions, despite feeding it deliberately suspect ammunition to see if I could make it fail. So the advantage of reliability means less than it used to. Semi-autos have an advantage that if it does jam in service, you can probably clear it quite quickly. If your revolver fails through the malfunction, the gun is no longer in the gunfight. And hopefully you aren't either. Hopefully you're never in a gunfight. But generally when revolvers jam, it's going to take tools and time to get them functioning again. Now, the sort of jams that revolvers can encounter, the first one is trivial, a bad primer. So you're shooting merrily along, boom, 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 and click. Primer doesn't ignite for whatever reason. Well, the solution to that is simple. Pull the trigger again, get another bullet under the hammer, and it's probably going to go off. Other much less common malfunctions include having a bulged primer that jams against the breech face, and to fix that, you're probably going to have to hold the hammer release and hit the side of the cylinder with a soft hammer. And this is maybe not the recommended way to do it, but it's what I see people do a lot. And force it to open so you can inject the bad cartridge. The last most common type of malfunction is that a bullet's crimp has failed under recoil and a bullet is sticking just out of the cylinder, so it jams against the side of the barrel when the cylinder tries to rotate. And that's not something you're going to suss out in the field and correct. Pretty often when it does happen, once you realize the problem, it's not that hard to push the bullet in far enough to open the cylinder and make the gun work. So it's also less of a problem on Colt revolvers, but we'll get back to that. So, excuse me. Now, revolvers tolerate neglect. Semi-automatic pistols tolerate abuse. If you're going into an abusive environment, like a desert or a swamp, the odds of your semi-automatic pistol working when you need it are much, much better than with a revolver, because revolvers have a lot of fussiness in their operation, and things can jam up rather easily with the introduction of grit or dirt or mud. Also, another thing that can happen is you can get a buildup of powder fouling under the extractor star, and so you go to reload and your revolver won't close because the extractor star can't go in far enough. A lot of old-time cops used to carry a toothbrush with them and regularly clean under that to prevent that from happening, especially ones that fired their revolvers a lot. So, and of course, the solution to the revolver not closing is probably to throw it at the bad guy like he's 1950s Superman, because you're not likely to be able to clear it in the heat of battle. And speaking of the heat of battle, you only got 6 shots, maybe as many as 8, or in some 22s as many as 10, but you haven't got that many shots, and reloading is not as fast as a semi-auto. So it would behoove you, if you're going to count on a revolver for self-defense, to be a very, very good shot with it and make those 6 to 8 rounds count. Because probably in the course of a gunfight, that's all you're going to have, because if the bad guys are still in operation after 6 to 8 shots, they're probably not going to be keen on giving you time to reload. Now, with a semi-auto, if I'm on my game, I can reload in about 1.5 seconds. Odds are the bad guys are never even going to realize that I've had to reload. With a revolver using a speed loader, on the best day of my life, it took 3.5 seconds, and on average, closer to 4 seconds. We'll talk more about that on the tabletop. And we're going to go to the tabletop and look at some of the revolvers I fired earlier in the video. The first of the two types of revolvers are single-action revolvers. These are famous from westerns and similar entertainment, and they operate very simply. If the gun is loaded, which this is not, you simply cock the hammer all the way and it's ready to fire. And every time you cock the hammer, it rotates the cylinder to bring up a fresh cartridge until you're out of cartridges. Now, how many cartridges are in it depends on which style of single-action revolver it is. All modern single-action revolvers, this is not a modern single-action revolver, have a device to prevent the hammer from striking the firing pin unless the trigger is pulled all the way to the rear. It's called a hammer safety, transfer bar, various types of mechanisms. And on a gun like this, you can load all 6 cylinders, all 6 chambers of the cylinder safely, because dropping it on the hammer can't hit the firing pin, so nothing happens. Older style guns have a firing pin that is, when the hammer is down, the firing pin is pushed forward, either attached to the hammer or, as in this reproduction, a separate piece inside. So it is not safe to carry this with the hammer down on a loaded chamber, because any impact on the hammer will set it off. There is a safety notch. You should not rely on it. They are notoriously easy to break if you drop the gun and it hits on its hammer. So, for safety purposes, and I'm going to use this gun, the way typically that you load a single-action revolver is you bring the hammer to half cock. On Rugers, you don't have to. You just open the loading gate. And then you will load a chamber, and you can see these are dummy shells. Load a chamber, skip a chamber, and then load 4 more chambers. This way, when you cock the hammer fully, it brings the hammer over a chamber with no round in it. And you can see through the gap there, there's no cartridge rim. And now the gun is safe to carry. And as I say, this is a modern single action, so you can load that chamber and be fine. To unload, you line up, bring it to half cock, open the loading gate, and you use this ejector rod under the barrel to push the cartridges out. This gives you a glacially slow reload. Since these cartridges haven't been fired, they'll basically just fall out. When they fire, they tend to expand so that they need a push to get them started. And that's single-action revolvers. This one is a .44 Magnum, and it has taken big game. And it's a very nice gun. Single-action revolvers are particularly good for hunting applications because every shot you have a nice, crisp, short, light trigger pull. In this case, about 2.5 pounds. And that's conducive to good accuracy. The longer barrel means you have a long sight radius, which means better precision. So they're very much favored for hunting. Now, there are extremely powerful double-action revolvers as well, like the .500 Smith & Wesson Magnum, which, honestly, I'm not sure what anybody needs that gun for since dinosaurs are extinct. If you encounter a gun without an injector rod, commonly called a sheriff's model, although the original Colt, with great imagination, called it the ejectorless model, it operates just the same, but you will need a separate rod to poke the empties out. And these guns were generally for people who wanted something quick and handy and didn't anticipate the need to reload. But as you can see, they're very, very simple in both operation and in their mechanicals. Modern double action or single action revolvers are extremely reliable because there's just very little to go wrong. Older styles can have springs that are fragile, parts that are easier to break, but still, by and large, you cock the hammer, you pull the trigger, it's gonna go bang. So, double action revolvers are revolvers in which pulling the trigger both cocks and releases the hammer. And these are far and away the most common type of revolver in use today. And they are best suited to defensive purposes, although there are large frame, large caliber guns suitable for hunting as well. And these were invented late in the 19th century. Well, this type was invented late in the 19th century. Swing-out cylinders go back almost as far as revolvers, but they didn't become a popular feature until the end of the 19th century. And there will be some sort of device here that you either push forward, push in, or pull back to open the cylinder. And once the cylinder is open, you can fill the holes with bullets, close it, and you're ready to shoot. And typically, for defensive purposes, you're going to be firing double action, which means a long, relatively heavy trigger pull. Typically, this is in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 pounds. These are rather better because they've been worked on a bit. Now, one advantage of these is that if you put in snap caps, you can do a lot of dry fire practice and get very good at holding the sights and the gun steady while you pull the trigger. You do not want to use a thumbs forward grip, because if your thumb is far enough forward, the blast from the cylinder gap will toast the end of it unpleasantly. You don't want that. These can, generally speaking, be cocked and fired single action, but on a defensive revolver, when would you? That's mostly used for target shooting. So, revolvers are very simple to operate, but the manual of arms is more complex, and mastering that double action trigger is more difficult than the lighter, friendlier triggers on semi-automatic pistols. Although there are semi-automatic pistols that are also double action only. Typically, the size used most for self-defense in this day and age is the small frame, J-frame, Smith & Wesson. And that is a 5-shot, very compact revolver. This one is a airweight Chief Special, which means it has an alloy frame, and it weighs about, I think, if I recall, 14 ounces. And this one is set up to use double action only, because with the 2-inch barrel, the small size, it's really not a precision gun. Although you can achieve surprising precision with them. As a stunt, people routinely make 100-yard shots on torso-sized silhouettes with these. The problem isn't that the gun is inherently inaccurate. Like most small guns with a short sight radius, the problem is that they are difficult to shoot well, and you have to train. And again, get some snap caps, do a lot of training on mastering that double action trigger, and of course, taking it to the range and shooting it as much as possible will be of a great benefit. Now, the two most common types of revolvers that people buy these days are Ruger's and Smith & Wessons, where the cylinder rotates counterclockwise, and Colts, where the cylinder rotates clockwise. And that's the big difference between them. The magazine, or the, cylinder release on the Colts is this piece here that you just pull back and you can pop it open. Ruger's have a button here that you press. It's fairly self-explanatory. And this, by the way, is a Fudds special reproduction. I did a whole video about it, as have innumerable other people. So we're not going to get deep into the weeds on this. Now, as mentioned, reloading revolvers is slow. So you tend to want to use a device to make it faster. And the most common type is called a speed loader. It holds as many rounds as the gun does that it's for. This is a Safariland style speed loader. And the two types are generally ones that release on insertion, like the Safarilands, and ones where you twist a knob, like the HKS. So to reload the gun, you open the cylinder, and this is the way I was trained. You hold the gun in your left hand, eject the empties, insert the speed loader, and on this style, you just press it in and it releases the cartridges, and then you drop the speed loader. I did a video on using speed loaders too. So again, you can see these are dummy cartridges. There are no primers. The backs are painted kind of pink red. Now on the twist type, it's almost identical, except that you need to twist a knob to release the cartridges. Then you have to make sure they all go in. And again, you're ready to go. And as I mentioned before, or maybe I didn't, on the best day of my life, I can reload a double action revolver with a speed loader in about 3.5 seconds. With a semi-auto on an average day, I can do it in 1.5 to 2 seconds. In either case, this is slower, and probably my average is closer to 4.5 seconds. Which isn't that long until somebody is very invested in killing you, in which case it's going to feel like forever. It is always a good idea to take cover while reloading, if at all possible. Now, another method of reloading faster is the speed strip, which is just a neoprene strip that holds cartridges. And you just peel them off into the chambers. And my best time doing it that way is probably around 8 seconds, which is pretty slow. But reloading in a self-defense shooting for a civilian is an extremely rare occurrence, and sometimes you might feel the trade-off of the slower reload is balanced by the fact that it is so much easier to conceal one of these than it is one of these loaded with 6 cartridges or 5 or whatever. Much flatter, much easier, and these are cheap. Speed loaders are not expensive. These are cheap. I think I pay $8 for 3 of them off Amazon. And that's the basics of double action revolvers. Now, one thing you can see is these have different grips, each one of them, and these grips fit my hand. This one fits my hand less well, but this is a reproduction of an earlier style of gun, and they didn't have fancy handles. This one is a target style grip, or it would have been a duty style grip when people still carried revolvers on duty. Big, hand-filling, comfortable for a variety of people. Fits a lot of bills. This one is set up for maximum concealment with a very trim, very small grip and what's called a T-grip adapter or a grip adapter. This one is an actual Tyler T-grip. And grip adapters like this, not precisely like the Tyler, but of various types have been in use for much of the 20th century to the present day. And it does give a significantly better grip on the gun than trying to force my big meat hook into the smaller opening there. It is possible for me to shoot a J-frame Smith & Wesson without the adapter. It's just better with. Oh, and that brings to one last thing. If you're loading individual rounds, which not coincidentally is called a dead man reload. So if you have to reload loose rounds, what you want to do is stick a round or two in the cylinder, And with the Smith & Wesson, rotate it clockwise. This means that if you have to close the gun in a hurry to fire, the loaded rounds are the first thing that comes up. And if you're loading individual rounds, you may suddenly discover that you need to shoot before you've gotten all 6 rounds in. And I suppose this is an advantage for the revolver of a sort, but if it comes up, something has gone horribly wrong. The most common calibers revolvers are chambered in these days are .38 Special and .357 Magnum. And there's a lot to be said for having a .357 Magnum, because they also shoot the lower powered .38 Special, because they're the same caliber, because everybody lies about their caliber. Although .357 is actually .357, it's just .38 Special is also .357. Let's not go there. So you have the option of running full-powered Magnums for serious use and practicing with .38 Special. And this will generally preserve the life of your gun if you're shooting a K-frame Smith & Wesson. And there are larger, stouter frame guns available from Ruger, Smith & Wesson, and Colt. So if you have a choice, it might be wiser to get .357 Magnum. They're also available in calibers like .45 Long Colt, which is a holdover from black powder days, and .44 Smith & Wesson Magnum. Now, there are other calibers available. Through the use of a spring-loaded flat steel clip, you can fire semi-automatic pistol cartridges through revolvers, and they are made in .380 9mm most commonly, but also 40 Smith & Wesson 10mm and .45 ACP. And with a full moon clip, you can reload very quickly. You should watch some of Jerry Mikulek's videos of him doing this. It's like magic. Then his whole shooting thing is kind of like magic. So, Jerry Mikulek, look him up. It's worth watching. Yeah, so you're not going to suffer for calibers. Many of the calibers, like .32 Smith & Wesson Long, .32 20, even more so, are pretty much obsolete these days. Not too many people shoot them here in America, although .32 Smith & Wesson Long remains very popular in Europe for target competition. And so most of the brand new revolvers on the market chambered for that caliber are European. There's also .32 H&R Magnum, which kind of .38 Special power range, and .327 Federal Magnum, which is nearly as powerful or in the same power range as .357 Magnum. And some people see a very definite point to that, like getting an extra cartridge in the cylinder. So every gun for defense is a trade-off. Only you can decide if the trade-offs are worth it to you. One of the trade-offs you are going to have to make if you decide to defend yourself with a revolver is training. You're going to have to do a lot of dry fire practice. You're going to have to practice reloads. And you're going to have to practice on the shooting range. And better yet, if you can practice in action shooting matches where you have to do reloads under stress, because you will learn a lot. And it appears that doing pistol things while under a lot of stress, while not as stressful as an actual shooting incident, it helps. So, they're outdated, even obsolete for duty use. Doesn't mean they're useless, and it doesn't mean it's stupid to rely on one. It's just not for everyone. If you like the video, hit the like button below. It really helps the channel. It helps Facebook notice that we're here and gets the word out to more people who might be interested in the content. Anyway, hope this finds you well. Stay safe, take care, and we'll talk to you again real soon.